It's my pleasure to welcome to you one of the greatest think tanks when it comes to your rights and your ability to live your life with your freedoms. Ladies and gentlemen, the president of the Tertium Quids, John Taylor.
Good afternoon. I have read that as a young man, Thomas Jefferson had a hobby. He would write a thought in what was called his commonplace book, and then he would refine what he had written, and he would edit it, and he would edit it until he had distilled it down to a point that it contained the original thought, but that thought was expressed in the fewest words possible. The hobby obviously served Jefferson well, because a few years later it took him a sentence and a half to alter the history of the world. It took him a sentence and a half to stand the political world on its head. That sentence and a half, undoubtedly the most famous in all of American literature, is a sentence you have all heard, but maybe you've never really listened to. Maybe you've never really thought about what Jefferson was doing with his sentence and a half. The sentence and a half is, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. There you have it. In a sentence and a half, Jefferson established a new order for the ages. It took him a sentence and a half to answer the great questions of political science. No longer was the political hierarchy the king, the court, and the great unwashed. Now the role of the sovereign would be performed by the people. People had rights. Those rights did not come from government, so those rights couldn't be taken away by government. The power government had was only by virtue that it was given by the governed, and the purpose of government was limited to just securing rights. And whenever government overstepped its bounds, the people could choose between altering or abolishing that government. Now let's add a little context to this, because sometimes we feel much beleaguered in the world that we live in today. Jefferson and the rest of the founders were no mere opportunists. At the time Jefferson wrote his sentence and a half, there was a king on the throne in England, a king on the throne in France, a king in Spain, a king in Prussia, a czarina in Russia, an emperor in China, and a shogun in Japan. At that time, Jefferson's own country was being occupied by the greatest imperial force the world had ever known, the British. But you see, our founders recognized that there were two ways to organize society. One coercively, through the legalization of plunder, and the other voluntarily, through the recognition of markets and private property rights. Fortunately for us, our ancestors chose to leave us a legacy of freedom. My, how things have changed. Whereas the founders believed the role of the government was to protect rights, today the primary role of government is to serve as a financial intermediary between the people who produce wealth, that's me and you, and the people who want access to that wealth, who oddly enough seem to be the large donors to political campaigns. Today the Jeffersonian hierarchy of the people being free to live their lives, with government ensuring that we can do just that, has been replaced by a system where increasingly the people seem to exist for the benefit of the government. They don't want to kill us, fortunately, because we are perceived to be too valuable for that. They just want to shear us once every year, happens to be today, from sovereigns to sheep in 233 years. But let's change gears for a moment. We've discussed what our founders stood for and what they tried to pass on to us. Let's discuss what we stand for. Will we reassert our sovereignty, or every April 15th, will we stand naked in the fields, ripped off and humiliated again by the government that we let get out of control? In the last 5 years of President Bush's term, the federal government grew by $1 trillion. The federal government today spends $193 million per hour on just entitlements. That's not the whole federal budget, that's just entitlements. On Good Friday of last year, the Social Security and Medicare trustees released their annual report, which showed that the present value of the unfunded liabilities for just Social Security and Medicare is now over $100 trillion. The prescription drug bill passed during the Bush administration added $8 trillion of unfunded liabilities to a program that was already underfunded by $15 to $20 trillion. David Walker, you may have heard of. He was the former Comptroller General of the United States and the head of the General Accounting Office. For years now, has been crisscrossing this country on what he calls his fiscal wake-up tour. His purpose has been to bring attention to the perilous fiscal position that we're in today. Walker has stated, quote, "The most serious threat to our future is not someone hiding in a cave, but our own fiscal irresponsibility." Now, why does he say that? The reason he says that is because beginning on January 1st of last year, some 78 million Americans in the baby boom generation became eligible for Social Security. In 3 years, they start becoming eligible for Medicare. That's an average of almost 10,000 new beneficiaries every day, 365 days a year for the next 20 years. Who could have possibly seen this coming? The answer is anybody with a brain. Walker has also said, "We are mortgaging the futures of our children and grandchildren, and that is not only an issue of fiscal irresponsibility, but it is also an issue of immorality." Today we are told that our financial crisis is due to the failure of capitalism. But what do out-of-control government spending, $193 million an hour for entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and prescription drug bills have to do with capitalism? Absolutely nothing. Let's get a little bit more, well, let me bring you to what I'm here to announce today. There are several ways we can handle the current fiscal crisis. We can dramatically raise taxes. I don't know where that's going to come from. I don't have that kind of disposable income. We can go into more debt, but the Chinese are already indicating that's not going to happen. We can simply print money, but that will collapse the value of the dollar. Historically, governments love running up debts with a high value of a currency and paying off those debts with a depreciated currency. And that's just too bad for you if the value of your assets are destroyed in the process. But there's a fourth alternative, and that's what I want to get to. We can get our government back to its original function, and that's protecting rights. We can make sure that politicians know that if they need more revenue, they had better maintain an environment conducive to economic growth. We can make